Brian Walker, could you tell us a little bit about your research?
Well, my own research began, I'm an ecologist, and so I was working on savanna ecosystems originally, but then various different kinds of ecosystems, and got intrigued by big changes that occur in them. Sometimes unexpected, surprising changes that seem to be irreversible, or it was really, really difficult to get the system back like it was again before. So I became more and more interested in the idea of resilience that was emerging at the time. And this really leads to, how do those systems self-organize? How do they absorb change, keep going, keep managing to function like they were? But then beyond some point they don't. So there are limits to the self-organizing capacity. And it really, that was my area of interest. And from there it's moved into how ecosystems link up with social systems, so that the same kinds of self-organizing capacities take place. And sometimes the surprise might occur in the social part, sometimes in the ecological part, but often there are limits to the amount that systems can absorb change, and so that's really where I come from.
Your new article in Science talked about interactive effects and missing institutions. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Well, yeah, let's take the second part first, the missing institutions. Most of the institutions that we have in the world today that have developed successfully for controlling the way in which we use our resources have been developed at scales that people operated at, which were local scales and up to national scales. And the institution of the nation has been a very powerful thing since Thomas Hobbes for 300 years. And what that's been able to do is prevent people from destroying a nation in large. And the difficulty is that many of the problems that we now have are beyond the scale of the nation. They're global in scale. But all of the inbuilt strong institutions we have are national scale institutions. So we're struggling to try and figure out how we can cooperate as a globe. How do we get to behave as if we were all one nation? And we don't want one national government for the whole world or one global government, but that's the problem, is that we don't have institutions that operate well at the scale of the globe. We have a few. So we have things like the WTO, and some people have concerns about aspects of the WTO, but nevertheless it works and most nations agree to it. So they give away some national authority for a greater good that eventually does them good. We get some distance along that with the World Health Organization, because people really have a recognition that their own well-being depends on global well-being in that sense. But when we come to things like rapid ecological change and climate change, we can see how difficult it is at the moment with things like the climate change agreements. We've had success where it was easier with the ozone issue, which was the Montreal Protocol. That worked because it wasn't really difficult to make that work. There was an easily available substitute that people could put in place, and so it was something that was doable. But we're grappling now with how people can give away the advantages for themselves operating at a national scale to operate and work collaboratively at international scales. And it's compounded by the fact that we work in a piecemeal way. So each of these problems is tackled as if it was a separate thing that we could tackle. But they interact. And that's why we talk about interactive effects of global drivers. And we lack institutions not only that operate at the global scale, but we lack institutions that take into account the interactions between these different drivers. So for instance, some of the efforts being driven at the moment at international scales is to get an agreement, just trying to pick one off the top of my head right now, but let's say the biofuels debate. How can we stop mining carbon, that's old carbon, and adding it to the atmosphere by perhaps using biofuels? Well, that's fine, but if we keep with that single thing in mind, what we're ignoring is what are the secondary effects of promoting biofuels? And there's a lot of examples now coming out of the literature where if this results in pushing crops for biofuels into regions that are marginal for crop growth, and you put a lot of extra nitrogen on to make them work. The economics might say, look, this is quite good, and some nation might be able to, in the short term, make some money out of a biofuels program. But the secondary effects on other aspects of the climate and on other aspects of the environment, such as in the case of America, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, is being made worse by the fact, could be certainly made much worse by the fact that a lot more cropping will take place in semi-arid areas with more fertilizers that eventually run off into rivers. So these are the interactive effects, and we don't take those into account. All of the institutions, we deal as if they're separate and isolated, whether they're health, whether they're environment, whatever. So we're trying to understand, how do we put in place institutions that work across these interactive effects at the global scale.
If I can follow up on that, what kind of possible solutions would you have to sort of indeed find that missing link?
Well, that's one of the points of the paper, is that we don't try and come up with many concrete examples, solutions right now, because we don't think they exist. But we're trying to give pointers into how one might get there. So one is to evolve existing institutions and to try and work on one and say, how would we take the best of that and increase it and improve it? How would we now upscale that institution to work at the globe? What would we need to do and put into that to make it work at a scale higher than it is? So it's a case of taking different problems and seeing whether we can adapt what's there. But in some cases we'll have to build brand new ones. And I think the global climate change issue that we're going through right now is an example of how we have to build brand new ones. So it's not going to be easy at all. One key part of this is that we actually identified 3 classes of institutions that we need to develop. And the one that we're talking about is actually now the regulatory part. How do you get people to give up something they've got, where cheaters will get punished and people will agree to abide by new rules? And so that's one set of institutions. For those to work, the other 2 types of institutions that are missing have to do with understanding and knowledge, and institutions for assembling information at global scale so that everybody actually really understands the consequences of what's happening. And those aren't good enough. They're not as difficult to happen, but we need much more effort. That would, for example, things like the IPCC gives us the information that's coming out of scientific analyses about what might happen. But we need a lot more effort in terms of other aspects of global change that are occurring, so that the knowledge is speeded up, it's synthesized, and it's spread much better than it is now. And the second really important class of institutions are to do with human behavior. We still are locked into growth is good, consumption is good. We have to try and think about how do we change the behavior patterns of humans so that they wish to do and behave differently to the way they are now in regard to natural resource consumption.
And as a resilience researcher, you study not only the adaptation capacity but also transformation and transferability. Could you tell us a bit about the difference between the two, between adaptation and transformation?
Well, that's really very key. And of course, adaptation is kind of obvious. Things change and so you adapt. People do that all the time. And in itself, that's entirely appropriate. But there comes a time when, if the external conditions have shifted fundamentally so that the kind of thing you're trying to adapt actually has got beyond the point of being adaptable, then everything you do actually just makes it worse. And I think this is often best summed up in the words of Warren Buffett, the great investor, and he talked about the first rule of holes. And the first rule of holes is that when you're in one, stop digging. And the reason why that makes sense is that everything you do to try and not die, if you want, or collapse as a system, it's a kind of a slight edge to what you're doing, but it actually is just digging the hole deeper. There are parts of the world, for example, parts of the Sahel, other parts of the world, where people in small communities are caught in poverty traps. And and trying to adapt to those poverty traps actually just makes it worse and worse for them. What they have to do is transform to a different mode of living, a different way of earning a living, of functioning. And that is kind of opposite in many ways to adaptation. If you look at it from the point of view of an industry, there is often, instead of looking at it from a regional perspective, it sometimes gives a pointer to this. If, for example, we were looking at only adaptation and thinking it was appropriate that all industries should be given the right to adapt and do it, well then the asbestos industry would still be trying to adapt to make itself a viable industry. But as knowledge became available and as the effects of asbestos became apparent all over the world, we had to transform. We had to transform into a way of doing things that no longer involved asbestos. But if it had been left up to the proponents and masters of the asbestos industry, they would have persisted and prolonged the adaptation process. So I think the tobacco industry is following in the footsteps of the asbestos industry. So I'm suggesting that adaptation can sometimes be a negative aspect, prolonging what actually has to happen. And if that happens in the context of human well-being and lifestyles, it makes it more and more difficult to transform the longer that hole is being dug deeper. So it's a tension zone, because in many cases it may not be necessary to transform, and then adaptability is very important and we need to promote it. So this is not an easy question to answer, but that's the distinction.
Indeed. Do you think it's possible for humans to change their way of thinking and indeed?
I think they have, and I think if it was not possible we'd be in serious trouble. But times change, circumstances change, and what was considered okay by people is suddenly no longer considered okay. We got rid of slavery. In the middle of the last century, there were long debates in the Houses of Parliament in Great Britain that the entire future economy of the world depended on the continuation of slavery. Well, that was shown not to be so, and it's gone. So we do change. We change in many ways, and people have evolved, and their behavior and their touchstones of ethics shift and evolve as well. What we have to do is to try and see what is in the long-term best interest of human well-being, and what kind of behavior do we need to adopt to enable us to improve people's general well-being all over the world. And it depends on that behavior changing, because it's that kind of ethical touchstone that will eventually be the major constraint on those who are trying to not go along with the changes that we need.